Welcome to the Elden Conspiracy. In our universe, stars are masses of burning plasma, held together by their own gravity and fueled by a nuclear fusion reaction, which consists of hydrogen atoms turning into helium. The same cannot be said of the stars in Elden Ring. In this video, we will go on a convoluted journey, going down the rabbit hole of understanding what the stars might be, and if something like outer space exists outside the lands between. We hear throughout the game by different sources that stars are sentient, that they have some control over fate, and that they also create a kind of amber which the Sorcerers of Grail called Glenstone. Taking the lore at face value in this regard can lead to one questioning their own sanity, since contradictions and inconsistencies abound. I will try to navigate these inconsistencies and deliver what I hope is a comprehensive theory of stars in Elden Ring. The first sign of the importance of stars is the Astrologer Origin when you create a new character. The Astrologer uses Glenstone sorcery, and we learn very soon that the Astrologers of the Lands Between became Sorcerers and founded the Academy of Grail. Most sorcery requires Glenstone as a fuel or catalyst, and in the areas populated by Sorcerers we see Glenstone growing out of the ground in crystalline formations. The study of Glenstone is pursued as a kind of alchemy or science. When we meet Selens, she gives us a better picture on the origins of Glenstone.
Our art draws upon the powers embedded in Glenstone. But what is the nature of such power? Glenstone is the amber of the cosmos. Golden amber contains the remnants of ancient life and houses its vitality, while Glenstone contains residual life and thus the vitality of the stars. It should not be forgotten that Glenstone's sorcery is the study of the stars and the life therein, a fact lost on most sorcerers these days.
Here she makes a clear distinction between gold and amber, which holds the remnants of ancient life, and the amber of the star's Glenstone, which contains residual life. The strange thing about this theory is that residual and ancient aren't mutually exclusive qualities. Something can be both residual and ancient. Let's look at her speech in Japanese. The Japanese translation doesn't make this type of distinction between ancient and residual, but the back translation of Glenstone as pyroxene is interesting. Pyroxene is a type of crystal which forms in metamorphic rock, like basalt or volcanic glass, and also meteorites. This fits the presumed extraterrestrial origins of Glenstone. The Japanese term kiseki uses the kanji for radiance, shine, sparkle, or gleam, combined with the kanji for stone, literally Glenstone, a rather fitting translation for a fantasy world. Now, when we hear the phrase Amber of the Cosmos, the more experienced Elden Ring players will probably think about the various stone astrolabes we see throughout the Lands Between. We can find starlight shards at the base of these astrolabes. The item allows us to refill our FP if we are low, but it is also a finite resource, there being no way to farm them. Also, they can be used as a currency to buy puppets from Selevus. We learn through Selevus' questline that the starlight shards can be used to make the potion capable of turning a person into a puppet. This is a practice inherited from the Nox. Though the astrolabes appear like some device meant to interpret the movements of the heavens, by observing, say, the shadow cast by the sun or the moon, you wouldn't actually be able to use them that way, because they all point in different directions. In our universe, in order to use a sundial properly, for example, one would have to point north. The fact that the astrolabes of the Lands Between point in all different directions means that the astrologers probably were not observing the stars or celestial bodies in quite the same way we do. As has been mentioned by many lore hunters, the astrolabes are shaped like a cup cut in half, like they are meant to collect amber of the stars filtering down through the sky, which over the centuries turns into a solid starlight shard that someone can use. But in the context of Selens' theory, this all seems very weird, because while starlight shards are the best candidate for star amber she talks about, nowhere in the lore or in the environment do we see any connection between the astrolabes and Glenstone. It is true we see sorcerers venerating the astrolabes, and see them perhaps as important monuments, but we never see glintstone growing around them consistently, nor do we ever read about starlight shards being a type of glintstone. I don't think Selens is completely wrong here, but I think there are holes in her theory. So what is glintstone? Where does it come from? Let's do some detective work. Around Liurnia, glintstone seems to just grow out of the lake, both in shade and sunlight. Glintstone can also show up within living beings, such as fireflies or moss. Interestingly, the fly's description mentions how the glintstone poisoning hinders its ability to beguile potential mates. In Liurnia, glintstone sort of gets into everything. Even dragons become suffused with glintstone after devouring countless sorcerers. This reminds me of the effects of mercury on the food chain in aquatic environments of our own universe. Big fish eat lots of little fish, thus accumulating the total mercury contamination of their prey. So glintstone functions as a kind of element that remains in nature that is difficult to break down. But another way of looking at glintstone would be as a kind of parasite. As Selens says, glintstone harbors the remnants of residual life. There is one type of life form who is entirely composed of glintstone, the Crystallians. Crystallian item descriptions always mention their created status. The line about them wishing their creator would carve them new brethren implies that they cannot reproduce. This, and the descriptions of their faint cognition, make them seem almost like robots. What's clear is that while the Crystallians are always found in the vicinity of glintstone formations, the lore firmly states that they are created beings, and do not simply arise from the same process as the glintstone itself. That the residual life within glintstone must be harnessed by another will. That glintstone is powerful, yet to a degree soulless. Still, this mysterious creator of the Crystallians must have some vital knowledge of glintstone, or perhaps is partly responsible for its existence on this plane. If we look elsewhere, we can find glintstone in the myriad tunnels which dot the lands between. This cracked crystal we find embedded in the walls is surely a type of glintstone, being used in crafting the cuckoo glintstones, which the Knights of the Cuckoo are so fond of using. However, these are considered low quality by the sorcerers of Raya Lucaria, and in the tunnels you never see formations of solid glintstone like you do on the surface. The caves where you actually find large concentrations of glintstone are Celia Hideaway and Lakeside Crystal Cave. Both of these are secret locations guarded by sorcerers and Crystallians. So the presence of these areas still supports the theory of glintstone being mined from the earth, and that the sorcerers are casting illusions to hide the mother lode. But how did the amber of the stars make its way deep beneath the earth? Now we come to perhaps the most popular theory lore hunters have on the origin of glintstone, that glintstone meteorites have struck the lands between over the centuries, leaving deposits of glintstone under strata of earth. Meteorites are often called falling stars after all. This is a very reasonable theory, except when we comb the environment for clues, we run into a similar situation as we do with the stone astrolabes. You see, we can actually find meteorites in a lot of caves, and they're always flecked with gold. And in these caves, we don't find any formations of glintstone the sorcerers actually use. We can find craters in the overworld caused by meteorites, but instead of glintstone, we find meteoric ore mined by starcallers. And this is what complicates things further. Meteorites have their own kind of magic associated with them, gravity magic. The Onyx and Alabaster Lords channel their gravity magic through the use of meteoric ore in their weapons. General Radahn's blades are also composed of meteoric ore. Gravity magic appears to be a type of magic distinct from that practiced by the sorcerers of Raya Lucaria, which is backed up by its reliance on a different material. Except the meteoric staff mentions that it is tipped with glintstone. Are we supposed to think that meteoric ore is a type of glintstone? It's not entirely clear. What's also strange is the very intentional placement of gravity lord enemies in Liurnia. In Raya Lucaria, you can encounter a respawning Alabaster Lord in this area halfway up the central elevator. You fight him near what appears to be a grave or memorial. Behind Carey Manor, you can fight an Onyx Lord in the Royal Grave Everjail. Both Gravity Lords are encountered near graves. This makes me think there is some connection we are supposed to draw, that perhaps the Sorcerers or the Carians are descended from them, or that both institutions are founded figuratively and literally, on the graves of the Gravity Lords. The fact that the Sorcerers of Raya Lucaria are never seen using gravity magic, even the ones driven to a hermetic existence, and we never see them using meteorites, leads me to believe that gravity magic is its own thing, separate from Glenstone sorcery. So we've shown that Glenstone does not come from meteorites, and is not collected by the stone astrolabes. So where does it come from? In order to answer this question, we need to delve into the deeper history of the Lands Between. If we return to Selens' questline, there is a section in which we are required to transplant her primal Glenstone into a new body in Selvis' lab. This tells us several things. The Sorcerers are able to somehow upload their consciousness into Glenstone, in order to live past the natural lifespans of their bodies. This is perhaps why E.G. calls her a long-standing carrion weed. We can assume Selen has been transferring her consciousness between bodies for a very long time. The wider society of Raya Lucaria and the Carian royal family condemns this practice as heretical. This is part of why she was known as an apostate witch, because she used Glenstone in this way, among other things. The practice of infusing one's body with Glenstone is hinted at in the primal Glenstone blade's description. We read of the ancient astrologers cutting open their own hearts to infuse Glenstone with their souls. We can say that Selen and perhaps the founding sorcerers Azur and Lusat did the same thing. But this procedure of replacing one's heart with Glenstone in order to pass on one's consciousness requires a vacant body to transfer into. This is where the practice of puppetry comes into play. It's very likely the early sorcerers who discovered Glenstone used starlight shards to create bodies for their own personal use. Given these implications, we can see why this practice was eventually deemed heretical by Raya Lucaria and the Carian royal family, and why Selen, Azur, and Lusat were banished from the academy. It also reveals the hypocrisy of the Carian royals employing Selvis of all people. All of this makes it very difficult to gauge the timescale of these events, since there is no way to tell how many times Selen has body-hopped throughout the centuries. She says Azur, a founding member of Glenstone sorcery, was her mentor. This means she was probably around during the very beginning of Glenstone sorcery, before even the founding of Raya Lucaria. But before we go further back in time, it's important to talk about Selen's own goals and motivations. Halfway throughout her questline, Selen reveals to the player that she wants to restore the primeval current of Glenstone sorcery.
If you recall, I was exiled from the Academy of Raya Lucaria. It was for attempting to restore the primeval current of Glenstone sorcery. The toothless pedantry peddled by the Carian royal family can rot for all I care. I want Glenstone sorceries that open our minds, unbound by terrestrial taboos, no matter what we give in return.
This includes bringing back Azur and Lusat from their exile, to revive the old teachings and practices of the early sorcerers, when they lived in the north and were not bound by terrestrial taboos, so to speak. It is a classic mad scientist sort of motivation. Completing Selen's questline by helping her defeat Jaren will show her bringing Azur and Lusat back to the Academy in order to turn them into a Graven Mass. This is a rather tragic end for Selen, and it makes me wonder if this was her real intention or a kind of accident. The Graven Mass is an enemy encountered in certain areas of the overworld. Typically, they show up around rises or other sorcerer-themed places. They phase out of the ground and breathe some kind of noxious mist at you. Other than this, they have an inert, failed experiment kind of vibe, not the kind of being any sorcerer would reasonably aspire to become. The actual process of becoming a Graven Mass is worth analyzing. The headpieces of Azur and Lusat's armor suggest they replaced their whole brains with Glenstone. This procedure has put them in a semi-catatonic state, reminiscent of Master Willem from Bloodborne. It seems like Selen and her mentors were trying to replace more and more of their bodies with Glenstone, in order to see into the primeval current and become part crystalline. While this did allow them to develop their most powerful spells, it also left them in a state where they can barely function. This supports the theory that Glenstone has a soulless quality, that infusing one's body with it to a certain degree will take away agency and will. But this may simply be what it looks like from our point of view. Azure and Lucette, in the depths of their own minds, may be having experiences beyond our comprehension, that they are astral projecting into the cosmos, surfing the waves of space and time. Azure and Lucette did develop their most powerful spells while tripping on the primeval current, so it can be a source of information, or at least release one's dormant creativity. Primeval current is difficult to define. It is talked about almost like a parallel dimension, and also by Selens as both a subject and method of research. When Selens says she wants to restore the primeval current, what she means is she wants to revive the practice of replacing body parts with glintstone, pioneered by the early sorcerers. But given the states of Azure, Lucette, and the Graven Mass they eventually become, it appears like Selens and her colleagues are addicted to glintstone for its mind-altering effects. This may account for why her theories on the origin of glintstone are incomplete. When you complete her questline, she says this.
Recall what once I told you. That glintstone is the amber of the cosmos, and sorcery is the study of the stars and the life therein. When you become Elden Lord, please illuminate me. Lay bare the secrets of life which course the Elden Ring. Next time, I will be your student.
So she doesn't really know how life filters through the cosmos. Perhaps she is afraid of what may happen after her experiments. Which brings us now to talk about the first sorcerers, those astrologers who discovered the primeval current. The spell, Founding Reign of Stars, talks about a sorcerer who glimpsed the primeval current and whose vision became real. This is purported to be the first glintstone sorcery ever used. That you find the spell in the Heretic's Rise tells us what people thought of this event at the time. Or perhaps this rise was retroactively named, since the founder would have been an early sorcerer like Selens, and thus engaged in the same practices of replacing one's body with glintstone. This description also puts into question whether glintstone itself existed before this point, that perhaps glintstone came into being through this event. It's very likely that the Founding Reign of Stars represented the turning point, when astrologers became sorcerers. Before this point, they only dealt with starlight shards and their collection. But with the advent of glintstone sorcery, they had found a new source of power with which to found their own nation and culture. The culture of Sellia is interesting in this regard. While related to Rhea Lucaria in some way, the night sorceries of the Sellians appear to be a kind of branch or variation of traditional glintstone magic. I believe the night sorceries represent a kind of transition phase, a proto-glintstone magic used by the sorcerers before the practice had become refined into what it is today. The Staff of Loss doesn't seem to have a glintstone, implying that not all sorcery requires a specific medium. The night sorceries seem to draw on the power of the void, and are used frequently in assassination. This power of darkness may be related to the sorcerer's link to the Nox. This can be seen with the Carrion Glintblade sorcery emblem and its depiction of the chair crypts found in the Eternal Cities. Now the Nox themselves are not sorcerers, and the Eternal Cities have no glintstone, but as the astrologers developed their glintstone sorcery, they grew away from their Nox allies. We still haven't found a definitive explanation for the origin of glintstone. Having hopefully exhausted the lore on this topic, let's examine the environment. Wherever we see glintstone, it seems to be growing out of the ground, even in some indoor areas. There doesn't appear to be any common characteristics at first glance. The large concentrations of glintstone do have some commonalities between them. First observation. The Academy of Rhea Lucaria is built over a massive glintstone formation, but between the Academy and the glintstone is a kind of cemetery. Going through this cemetery, we encounter glintstone zombies who can steal your FP. This is the only place where these appear. It's almost like the cemetery was built first and the Academy was constructed around it when they discovered the glintstone. Caria Manor also has glintstone growing around it, and is also constructed above a cemetery. Now, we could just jump to the conclusion that glintstone just grows from dead bodies and leave it at that, but I don't think it's that simple. We can find gravestones all over the lands between, and there are more cemeteries without Glenstone than there are with it. It could be that both Caria Manor and Rea Lucaria are built above graveyards and have Glenstone growing around them. It's just a coincidence. Except there are some clues which are more definitive. There is a secret room in Rea Lucaria where you can find jar soldiers and the Graven School talisman. The talisman is found at the foot of a large glintstone crystal along with many human bones. We find elsewhere in the academy glintstone growing from piles of bones. In the debate parlor we find bones strewn about with small patches of glintstone growing from the ground. The central elevator shaft of the academy shows evidence that it's treated like a kind of dumping ground, almost like the sorcerers know that this must grow something. We know from the practices of the primeval sorcerers that glintstone can merge with organic matter, so it stands to reason that dead bodies can be used to grow glintstone. There must be some reason why we find jar people here. We know the jar folk collect the bodies of slain champions and absorb them. The sorcerers must be using the jar folk as a supply of raw organic matter to grow more glintstone. But what explains the glintstone we see in the overworld? We don't see bones near every glintstone crystal growing out of the lake. This is where we have to talk about the underground. The crystal, which forms the foundation of the academy, extends so far underground that you can see it from the Lake of Rot. The town of Celia lies beside the swamp of Aeonia. If glintstone can grow from organic matter, couldn't it also grow from the emanations of the scarlet rot? Think about how much the crystal would grow over the centuries. Here would be a good time to circle back around to the meteorite theory. Astel is the boss of the Grand Cloister area, and it is reasonable to conclude that Astel came in a meteorite which smashed through Noxtella, the Grand Cloister, and the Lake of Rot, leaving a massive glintstone crystal in its wake. The vast majority of meteorites we see are flecked with gold, and those that aren't are used in gravity magic. In neither case do they contain glintstone used by the sorcerers of Rea Lucaria. Therefore, this one glintstone meteorite would be an exception. Astel may not have been the original boss in early incarnations of this area. Astel has unused animations where it swoops down from the sky like Radon. This indicates that Astel must have been, for most of development, a boss you would encounter in the overworld or other outside location. If this is true, who would you have fought as boss of the Grand Cloister instead? The 1.0 version of the game has you encounter rot-infested ancestral worshippers, instead of the rot pests we see today. So maybe the original boss was the ancestral spirit. This is backed up by the similar assets on the ground in both arenas. But keep in mind this is all speculation. I'm not trying to say that cut content is somehow more valid than the final product. But I think this somewhat disproves the notion that the glintstone formation came from Astel or outer space. So there is room to conclude that the crystal formation under Rea Lucaria was not put there by Astel or a meteorite, but rather grew from the accumulated matter emanating from the underground Lake of Rot. This also accounts for the crystals growing out of the Lake of Liurnia. There is also inclusion of Crystallians who are infected with scarlet rot, but don't have any apparent negative symptoms from it. There are scarlet rot-infected crystal weapons. This represents a kind of symbiosis between glintstone and scarlet rot. So we've shown that glintstone probably did not come from outer space or the stars, if that idea has any meaning here. But it does hold the remains of residual life, as Selens theorized. Glenstone may have a more alien origin than we originally thought. Throughout the game, we hear of seemingly alien gods or entities coming in through portals. The aforementioned gravity lords tend to enter reality through portals. We also hear they came to life when a meteorite struck. Yet they seem to live in a kind of parallel dimension, and hop into this one from time to time. We also see Moog pierce the Formless Mother with his spear through a portal, so there is some precedent for alternate realities or dimensions. When the heretical astrologer peered into the primeval current, it is likely Glintstone came to the lands between in a similar way. When we think of something being alien or extraterrestrial, it is hard to break the habit of thinking this is merely a spatial relationship, that entirely new realities may exist beyond our perceptions. Going back to the subject of stars, while the term star is used broadly throughout this game, we can identify at least 3 kinds of extraterrestrial objects which have impacted the lands between. The first one we see after the defeat of General Radahn. This meteorite sent up a hail of rock, suspended in the air, traces of the latent gravity powers of meteorites. This impact opens the way to Nokron, and is an integral part of Rani's fated ascension as god of the moon. While this was one of the stars Radahn was holding back, we can say this is similar to the meteorites found near falling star beasts, due to the shared affinity for gravity magic. But there is also a second kind of falling star. We can find remains of this impact in the Cathedral of Manus Celis. This one left no rocks floating in the air, but rather starlight shards on the ground. This particular meteorite was a kind of starlight shard meteorite. What's interesting is that both types of objects are related to the fate of Rani and the rest of the Carian royals, since the impact at Manus Celis opens the way to Rani's 2 fingers, which she promptly kills. The third kind of star is the golden star sent by the Greater Will, bearing the golden beast who had become the Elden Ring. For all we know, this has happened only one time. As for the location, it would be logical to say Leyndell. The city of Leyndell is situated in a circular depression which has filled with water. It's easy to conclude that this came from a meteorite impact. You can also find the spell Elden Stars right under the city in Deeproot Depths. What's clear is that the stars are not only one thing, that there is a massive variety of beings and forces at work in the cosmos. Using the blanket term star is an attempt by the inhabitants of the lands between to make sense of things they don't understand. Taking all the evidence into account, it appears that Selens has things turned upside down. It's actually the golden amber which comes from the cosmos. The golden amber which makes up the Elden Ring came from the outer space of this universe. But Glenstone, while not being explicitly tied to anything extraterrestrial, might have a more mysterious origin than even the stars. This has been the Elden Conspiracy, signing out.